See, he's rolling and you don't say smart things anymore. Roll in my 5.0 with the ragtop down so my hair can blow. Girl is on standby waiting just to say hi.
Is this a Mustang thing? This is like a Ford 302 thing?
Ice baby. Okay, so after the 60s and the 70s, when you were an old man, there were the 80s and 90s.
No, that was my prime.
That was your
prime then.
And then there was this guy called Vanilla Ice who was...
that all the young whippersnappers are listening to.
And he sampled a guy from, well, after your era. Bum, 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 ba-da-dum, bum. Right? That was under pressure. And anyway, but he sang a song that was rolling in my 5.0, and I just don't think it would have worked if he was like rolling in my 2.3T. I feel like displacement and large displacement is ingrained in our society, and this whole turbocharger
in America.
Derek, fix your shirt. Or just pull your jacket down.
Yeah, you look like you have
I look obese.
Thank God I won't look fat for once. That's got to make it.
No, you're still going to look fat.
Shut up. You'll just look
we'll
almost
both
fat.
look fat.
I'll look. Thank you for that. Fuck am I talking about?
I was wondering the same thing. But if you don't know and I don't know, then we should probably just talk about something else. Like maybe the fact that this is another episode of the Carmudgeon Show. This is going to be a turbocharger episode. And that I'm Derek Tam-Scott. And that's Jason Camisa.
I love that you've started to pronounce your name the correct way, where you speak the hyphen.
I mean, yeah, nobody recognizes me if I don't do that. It's also incredibly convenient when you're like telling people how to spell your name, which is like weird because nobody's ever seen my name before when I'm telling it to people.
I thought Camisa was a pain in the ass, but Tam-Scott.
Well, people always put the M's and the S's in the wrong quantity and location.
Yeah. Displacement? Ingrained in American culture and not...
Yeah, I mean, there's no replacement for displacement. That's like a very American approach. You don't hear people saying that in any other language.
And yet Mercedes didn't make the 1.9, it made the 6.9.
I mean, they did make the 1.9, it was the 190E.
Yeah, or the 190 SL, which was actually not a 1.9, was it?
No, it was, I think. I don't know. Actually, I promise you I don't care because those cars are one of those things that I just really dislike.
But I think we can agree on one thing. Turbos suck and blow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, how's your turbocharged ownership experience been?
I have never, let me triple check this, other than cars that I bought for my mom, I have never owned a turbocharged car. The Lotus is supercharged, and that's the only forced induction vehicle I've ever owned, but I have never owned a turbo, and I really don't think I will.
So it's very intentional.
It's not. Well, we discussed a couple episodes back that I buy cars because of the way they drive, and I just don't particularly care for the way most turbocharged cars drive.
When you say turbocharged cars and the way they drive, are you talking about like the traditional definition with like turbo lag and all that, or do you mean like the contemporary sort of now we're going to have a torque peak that starts at 11 RPM and is like all of the torque for the entire time?
Both with one caveat. You have just made the same mistake that the entire industry makes, which is saying that a turbocharged car doesn't have lag.
Yes, but the difference in lag between now and 1980 is very stark.
And to be honest with you, in a lot of ways, I prefer the old way better. And here's why. Okay, let me first explain this whole lag thing. A turbocharger is an air compressor that blows. You know this, so bear with me while I explain to people who think turbos are magic and amazing. Sorry, guys. I'm gonna burst your little bubble here. But a turbocharger is nothing more than an air compressor to shove extra air into an engine, because the more air you have going in an engine, the more fuel you can burn, and therefore the more power you can make. A supercharger
You use the word stoichiometry. So there's always been a case where I was like, oh, when can I use the word stoichiometry as an adult?
Okay, well, we'll get there.
14, okay, 0.7.
Yeah, okay, we'll get there. So the idea being, the more air that you can throw in, the more power you can make. Supercharger is the same device, but it's driven mechanically off of the crankshaft, so that it's spinning all the time, even if it's clutched. They can spin up to speed very quickly. But a turbocharger, what powers that compressor is exhaust gases moving through it. When you close the throttle on a gasoline engine, you are restricting air from coming into the engine and being burnt. And therefore, restricting the amount of air that comes out the exhaust. And so the turbocharger slows down and doesn't stop, but it comes to a relative stop.
Yes,
Whereas
against the like 50,000 or
100, 150, 200,000 RPM. 180, I think, is where Ferrari draws their maxes. But when I crack open the throttle at 2,000 RPM from fully closed to fully open in any turbocharged car, there's going to be a delay between when I open the throttle, air is burnt, air is sucked in, burnt, turned into exhaust gases and power, and then spins that turbocharger up. And that amount of time has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. But at low revs, when there's not a lot of air moving through an engine, it's still considerable. And what I personally don't like, and this is not a good or bad thing, it's what I like and don't. What I don't care for is that when I, as a driver, call for a certain amount of power in a naturally aspirated car, there are two factors. There is throttle position and there is RPM. So at any given RPM, an engine is capable of making X amount of torque, and the throttle position determines that. In a turbocharger, that's not an XY plot, it's an XYZ plot. There's a third axis, which is time. And that time changes. At 2,000 RPM, from 0 to full boost might take, in an old car, it was not even achievable, right?
Correct,
right?
yes.
Like at a Porsche 930, 2,000 RPM is never.
You were never going to get boost.
In a modern car, that these car companies will publish their torque peaks at 1,200, 1,300, and 1,400 RPM. At 1,600 RPM, let's say, or 1,500 RPM, that lag could be measured in like 10, 12, 15, 20 seconds. You're never going to achieve that in the real world because you're hitting the gas, the engine is going to start making some power, it's going to start accelerating the car, which is raising the revs. You're never going to see boost under those circumstances in the real world. But you hit the gas at 5,000 RPM and you have maybe 0.8 of a second of a delay. So now in my head as a driver, when I'm sliding around a corner and I want maybe a little bit more power right now, I have to think of in terms of RPM and throttle position plus time, which changes not only with engine speed, but in what the throttle opening was beforehand. So if I'm going from half throttle to full throttle, there's far less of a delay than 0 throttle to full. And I don't like that variability. And that's why I don't like turbos. Why?
Flying is a lot like that, where there's like the 3 dimensions and the trade-off between altitude and speed and all of that. It's much more complex than driving, and there's an additional layer of stuff to think about. That's why I think really good pilots are so impressive. Anyway,
well, and let's not forget, talk about turbo lag. I mean, we've all been in a jet plane, and there are some of the pilots who I love. You're sitting on the runway and you're like cleared for takeoff, and they brake torque it. They hold the brakes and shove full throttle, and you hear the jets, and it takes 10 seconds for them to spool up, and then they let go of the brake and like all the champagne glasses go flying. But it takes a long time to get a jet to spool up, and it's the same thing as a turbocharger. And I don't personally care for it. What's your turbocharged experience been like? I asked this knowing the answer to this question.
We've talked about this car already. Can we stop talking about this
damn
car
and
because
I have
the suffering
video.
that it has caused me?
I have video. I mean, I don't have video of the dollars of you shelling out the multiple dollar bills, but I have video of it destroying the environment.
Yes, smoke screening. I mean, I think that's a representative of the fact that turbochargers work better when you have the kind of control that you can get on an engine today with the type of like responsiveness of computers and the type of measurements that they take. In the old days when early turbocharged cars came out, there was either no computers or the computers were sort of pretty rudimentary. And so when you are turbocharging old cars, like it's always a little bit of guesswork, and that's why they tend to grenade, which is what my Audi did.
In your Audi's defense, the engine did not grenade. All it was a turbo. The turbo itself grenaded.
Correct.
But we have, in our circle of friends, we have probably 4 Delta Integrales, and every single one of them has popped an engine in the last couple of years.
And you think that's because they're turbocharged?
They're turbocharged. So the problem, to bring to your stoichiometry, right? The problem with gasoline engines that are turbocharged, diesels don't have this problem, but the problems with gasoline engines is you have to burn. So to completely burn any part of oxygen you need 14.7 times as much air
As
as you
there is
have fuel.
fuel.
By weight or volume, I never remember which one. So let's say I have a tablespoon of fuel, I need 14.7 tablespoons worth of air effectively to burn that much. And your
It has
carburetor,
to be by weight.
it's by weight, right?
I think it has to be by weight.
Your carburetor or your fuel injection system in your car has one job and one job only, which is to measure the amount of air and give the appropriate amount of fuel. That's all they do. And carburetors sucked at this, which is why they were inefficient.
And you want it to be atomized. The
Well,
fuel
right,
should be
that's
atomized,
secondary,
so it's
right.
vapor.
That's true, that's secondary. But really their primary job is just measure the amount of air and give me the appropriate amount of fuel. If you run lean, which means you do not have as much air as you need,
So more air than you need for the fuel, which
right.
should be above 14.7
or
of
less than stoichiometric.
yes.
You're right. Yeah. Then the
Stoichiometric is the definition of having the exact right ratio of fuel to air.
right. And with gasoline and air, it's 14.7 to 1, right?
However, yes, so the downside of running lean,
Is heat.
yes.
So strangely enough, when you have not enough fuel, it doesn't run cool, which is what you'd think it is. It runs
Yeah.
hot, and that's what explodes gas engines. So a
Correct.
little itty bitty vacuum leak or a little bitty intake boot leak can cause you to run lean.
and most
blow your
cars
engine.
are designed to run to the left of 14.7 or slightly rich,
Rich,
because
yeah.
it's safer.
Right.
And so if you're trying to be conservative and not blow up your motor, then you'd like to run somewhere less than 14.7.
Which is actually the reason why the whole turbocharged downsize engine for efficiency thing is a farce, right? I mean, you can actually downsize an engine and get better fuel economy so long as you're out of the boost. Once you're in boost, the
Right.
only
The amount of fuel goes like
Way up.
Exactly.
way up. So
And the computers now know to do that to prevent the motor from blowing up, and pinging or
Right.
detonation, which you've probably heard of, is the result of not enough fuel.
Right. And so you can watch on modern cars with amazing engine management, which is to your point,
Which my Audi does not have.
right, which Audi doesn't have, but all
Because I think it's
modern
like an
cars do.
8-bit processor or something like
It's
that.
shocking. It's even that. It's probably like a 1-bit. It's a little German dude with an abacus going, I think we need this much fuel. But you can watch like a Ford EcoBoost go down to 10.0 to 1, which means it's wasting
really rich.
a huge amount of fuel just to stop itself from grenading. And that's another reason I don't like turbocharged engines. Naturally aspirated engines run at their most efficient in terms of unit fuel delivered per unit, unit fuel burned for unit horsepower created. They run at their most efficient at wide open throttle. That's my excuse for driving like a jerk. If you're running at your most efficient at like a quarter throttle and no boost, well, you're just being wasteful. So anyway, so you have an Audi, your Audi turbocharged thing, and you had a Porsche.
I had a Porsche 930, which I hated driving.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It was one of those things where, like, when you're a kid, you're like, oh, Porsche 930, like, along with the Ferrari F40 and the Lamborghini Countach, it is like the poster car for the walls of many children who grew up in the 80s and 90s. And so I was like, sweet, I'm going to buy one. And I bought it, and I had it for 18 months, and I think I drove it 500 miles, and I spent a bunch of money on it. And at the same time, I had the exact same car without a turbocharger. I had a turbo look Carrera, which was a 5-speed. So the problem with the 930 is that there's no boost available ever below 3,500 RPM. And it has a 4-speed gearbox because the 5-speed they didn't think could withstand the torque generated by the turbocharged motor.
Mm-hmm.
And the gearing is really wide, so it's very tall first gear. So like hill starts in San Francisco with no boost, and the thing's like
no compression. Does it have a low compression ratio too?
pretty low compression ratio, yeah. 'Cause
Meaning-
they're trying to protect the motor.
Right. So off boost, it had no power.
Correct. It was slower than a regular 911 off boost. And it had really tall gearing because the thing could do like 165, 170 miles an hour probably. And with
you have
only
to
4 gears, so you
right.
have to space the gears out appropriately. And so the day I decided I was going to sell the car I was on the Bay Bridge, and I needed to accelerate, and I downshifted to 3rd gear, and I was like at 2,500 RPM,
Yeah.
and I was like, there's no way I'm going to get any acceleration. So I'm like, okay, I'm going like 54 miles an hour or something like that. I have to downshift into 2nd gear on the highway to get any acceleration. And the boost in 4th gear started at like 75, 80 miles an hour.
God.
So you had no boost in 4th, you had boost in 2nd and 3rd. So you're downshifting into 2nd on the highway sometimes, and otherwise you're like in 3rd gear. It was just massive frustration. So the thing was slow most of the time. It wasn't responsive. There was no power below 3,500 RPM. and it just was a really ungratifying experience. So that was crap. I mean, it's also vintage turbocharged car experience.
Look, it's not just vintage. I mean, a Subaru STI is that way now.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. My brother had an STI, but it was like, the STI was much faster off boost than the 930.
I mean, it has been 30 years of technological progress between then. Although that's still port injected, that's still the kind of old school stuff. But my 911 turbos, right? We talk about no turbo lag, have come a long way, but they are still the worst of all the 911. Like, I actually like Porsche 911s, despite all the the shit that we've said on this. Like, I like driving a 911, but if you gave me a 911 turbo, I would hand you the keys back and say no, thank you. And there's two reasons. Number one, they don't sound good, unlike all the other 911s. And number two, they are so laggy that you can very easily catch yourself out. Now they're all automatics, but catch yourself out where a minivan is faster than you when you're off boost. And that's the thing, is why do you want a car that is so incredibly slow when it's slow, and then so stupidly fast that you're waiting, and then you hit the car in front of you? Give me a car that responds. If a sports car, to me, one of the hallmarks of a good sports car is that it does what I want when I want. It responds in a linear way to what I want.
In a transparent, natural, like organic way. And the 930 was not that, and it was a big disappointment for me personally. And I think that the market sort of like was really into those cars for a while, and then they were like, oh, just kidding, never mind, because they are kind of rubbish. They're much better with a 5-speed. The gearing, the gear ratios and the spacing between them helps a lot. I mean, it doesn't fix the fact that there's no power below 3,500 RPM, but it reduces in the real world the number of times where you're like, I would like thrust, and the car's like, I'm sorry, fuck you. It's just like, cannot. But I think also, I mean, being hard on the 930, I think it's also important to note like what the state of things was when that car came out. Like the 930 was really transcendent, and I went back when I was like shopping for one and like amping myself up for the purchase, like I always do. Like I was reading all the contemporary road press about the car, and there was all this like crazy effusive shit that was written about the car. And what I will say is that the car, like it's incredibly good at going fast, low drama. Like if you just get on a highway and start at 0 miles an hour and just boot it, and then you're like, what's involved in getting to 100 miles an hour? It's incredibly like good at doing that, like in a way that is unlike anything else that existed at the time. Like the amount of force, accelerative force that it generates between 3,500 and redline is really, really remarkable. And the car is like by the clock very fast. It's just the real world is where it starts to fall apart.
And you can say that about all turbocharged engines, right? I mean, they reduce drama. And this is a really interesting thing. We were talking about this last week.
Well, except for when the boost hits, and then it's like, who comes out?
Right. I don't care to think about that. But no, excuse me while I cough to death. When I was a kid, I had a book called Turbo. And it was this like book with a red turbo written on top, and it was a chronicle of every single turbocharged engine, a turbocharged car there was. And it was all the hottest of the hottest shit, right? So it was starting from Saab 99 turbo and 900 turbo to 911 turbo and all these like F40, all these amazing cars.
I mean, that's the era when like on the outside of the car it says turbo, and you're like, oh, it's the hot one.
But actually, what's happened in the last 35 years or so is that we've flip-flopped. And I think turbochargers are a really good tool.
And by that you mean that all the hot cars don't have turbos anymore.
Correct.
And all the boring cars do.
Correct. I think they're a really good tool for a daily driver because they, to your point, they reduce drama. They reduce engine speeds by increasing torque. They reduce the amount of engine speed that you need for any given acceleration. Therefore, it makes these cars relaxed. You don't have to have a screaming engine to go fast, and I don't think that's the point of a sports car.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it should be the opposite. You should have to work for your speed.
I agree with that.
And so, interestingly now, like the Turbo is the least appealing 911 of the lineup to me, and the GT3 is the most appealing. And the Carreras, which happen to be turbocharged, are somewhere in between. Because
but they're also calibrated to behave more like naturally aspirated.
They're specifically
cars.
lower. Their torque peaks are lower down, and they use smaller turbos for better response. And I think that's a better all-around car than the Turbo is.
Yeah. And in the 70s, that was like, I think the novelty of being able to go fast so easily was really, really exciting. And so they were like, this is the wave of the future, or like, especially when everyone was worried about safety.
And fuel crisis towards the end.
Yeah.
I mean, my mom had an 81 900 turbo, Saab 900 turbo when I was a kid. And I remember her saying this whole thing, this is turbocharged is there to save fuel. And she's not a car person, but that was what she was told. And the reality was, in some ways, it did, because it was a 2-liter that was there were 2 liters, right? Yeah,
That sounds right.
It was 2-liter with a turbocharge on it. That was 145 horsepower or so. And the next car that she got was a Peugeot 505 STX V6, which was a 2.8 liter with the same amount of horsepower. So you could have the same amount of horsepower from a smaller engine, and therefore you would therefore think that the car would use less fuel, even though in reality it didn't.
Yeah.
I just don't, I find it so interesting that we've flipped. That once Ferrari has gone turbocharged with the V8, I have less interest in them than I do the earlier stuff. And the V12 just becomes that much more magnificent.
Yeah, because it's naturally aspirated, and together with Lamborghini, it's the end of that formula.
It's the end. I mean, and what an end. I mean, the A12 Superfast is a 9,000 RPM, 6.5 liter V12. It's 800 fucking horsepower. That's instant. There's no waiting, and you get all the intake noise that turbochargers mute, and the exhaust noise that turbochargers mute. And I just kind of think we're going in the wrong direction, and I know I sound like an old man for that, but leave the turbos for the diesels. Like turbo diesels, there's a reason why people loved turbo diesels, because they were relaxed, quiet cruisers. And it's the same reason why everyone loves turbocharged gas engines. They're relaxed, torquey, can be very efficient cruisers. But when you're in a sports car, shouldn't you want that response?
I mean, certainly I do. So this is why you're saying you prefer vintage turbocharged cars.
I didn't qualify that. Yeah, you're right. But I love how outspokenly, ridiculously, stupidly turbocharged they are.
Yeah.
And I think that gives
You don't see that anymore. I don't know. I haven't driven a modern Porsche turbo, so I guess, but maybe that still exists. But like in the 930, like the difference between off boost and on boost was just like a light switch. Like it was absolutely asinine. I'm trying to think of what the oldest turbocharged car I've driven is. Probably like a mid-70s Porsche 930.
Well, 930 was, what was it, the third production
yeah,
turbocharged
so before
car?
that was the BMW 2002, which beat it by 2 or 3 years.
That was 72 or 73, right?
Yeah.
The 930 was 1974 for a 75 model year in the US, right?
I don't think there were any 75 US cars, but they did like calendar year 75, they were here.
Okay. And so Saab 900 turbo, 99 turbo was... Hold on, so 2002 was 73.
Wheels.
Yeah, Saab was later. Saab was later.
77 or 78.
Which means that the first ever turbocharged production car was the Oldsmobile Jetfire in 1962, I think.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Followed shortly thereafter by the Monza, the 180 horsepower turbocharged version of the Corvair.
Which is insane.
Well, and the whole reason why this all started, and I think it's interesting because we don't associate them with being very American, but I think the reason why they started in America was because of airplane engines. And during World War II, high altitude performance was really important because we started going on, like doing daylight bombing, so we wanted to go higher so that it was harder to shoot the planes down during World War II. And so, like, you have a density decrease at altitude for an airplane engine. So the airplane engines, if they don't have turbochargers or superchargers, are really breathless at altitude. And so high altitude performance, like climb performance, was super important during World War II as like a strategic advantage. And so the Americans were really the ones who pioneered all that stuff. And so like turbocharging we think of as being like sort of very 70s and 80s, but in the 1940s, like that was the thing that they had turbo superchargers, which was actually just a turbocharger, but they called it a turbo supercharger because supercharger technology already existed.
Right.
And so they were like, it's like a supercharger, but not. So we'll call it a turbo supercharger. But anyway, exhaust-driven turbine that boosted because then you get much more density because you have like density at altitude is a fraction of what it is at sea level.
Well, you can't breathe in a plane without
an oxygen mask.
Right.
So turbocharged cars began, interestingly, in the United States in an era when we don't normally associate American engineering with being the most innovative, because like fuel injection and independent suspension and disc brakes, all that stuff came from continental Europe.
Right.
But turbochargers came from
the
America.
U.S. I always say that America always invents something. Germany makes it work, and then the Japanese perfect it, and they make it reliable. And
inexpensive. Because the German way, it works, but it's expensive.
Always
and
expensive,
complex.
right? But actually, your point about the aviation stuff is really interesting because that explains what the naming of all these early turbo stuff. So like Oldsmobile, they called that engine the Jetfire, which is amazing.
Jetfire, yeah. detonation problem
Yeah.
with those cars. So like no computers at all. It's all
Right.
carbureted. So it's a turbocharged carbureted engine, which is just like
Double whammy of
What?
disaster.
so no ability to adjust fuel mixture or timing or any of that. And so they would have detonation problems, of course, because they couldn't finally control the fuel mixture enough. And so you ran into these situations like we were talking about earlier where there was not enough fuel. And so the way that they dealt with that was they had alcohol and water injection, which reduces temperature, which in
reduces
turn
the detonation. It reduces the chance of detonation.
Correct. So there was an alcohol injection system on the
What do they
first-
call? They call that jet fuel or
Yeah,
something
it was like
rocket fuel.
rocket jet fuel or something
Yeah.
like that. It was just water, distilled water and alcohol.
But that's, I mean, to your point, that's for aviation, like the whole jet age and everything else. They were taking a jet fire and rocket fuel and all this
Yeah,
other.
and it was the
cool
Oldsmobile
shit.
Rocket 88
Yeah.
motor. Like
Yeah.
that was where it. So anyway, but yeah, jet age. I mean,
Interesting.
and you see the jet motifs in like the shape of taillights and all that stuff. I mean, because that was like, let's pick the most sophisticated thing we can think of, which is like the space race and like
Name the
flying
cars after it,
supersonic
yeah.
and style and name the cars after
It's
that.
the one thing Americans do better than anyone else is marketing. To
Yeah.
this day, I mean, I was just in a Challenger
Oh, yes.
Hellcat.
1LE sounds
Demon.
good.
No, but I mean, think about what the names that the Germans, for example, come up with part numbers, right? So 1LE is an option code that's existed for many, many years, and so GM has taken advantage of the fact that its heritage
some
people
nostalgia.
know that a ZL1 means this and a ZR1 means that and a 1LE means this, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But most American car companies come up with the best names. Ford EcoBoost. That name, all that means is turbocharged downsized engine.
Yeah.
Eco and boost together, fucking genius. But I mean, all of the SRT, like Hellcat, Demon, like all the Ford Motors Voodoo, and like these were great at marketing. And yeah.
Yeah,
better-
and then all
better
the model names coming out of Germany sound like
part numbers.
part numbers. Or let's call it a VW Touareg, a word no one can pronounce and no one knows what it means.
It's better than Tiguan. You know the origin of the name Tiguan,
Oh
right?
God, no.
They literally combined the name. This I should also say, Volkswagen decided to allow Germans, actual like German citizens to
yeah,
decide
so
the
we'll
name
put
of
in
this
a
thing.
poll in the newspaper.
Right. So they put a poll in Autobild magazine, and they gave them a bunch of choices. And Tiguan was, and they were all half, the names of two animals combined. And Tiguan was half tiger, half iguana. That's where that name came from. So I mean, the original
Well,
VW
they're like,
names.
it's in English, it must be cool.
Yeah, of course it's wonderful. First of all, why would you let a German name an SUV, which is a distinctly American market thing,
Yeah.
especially at the time? And then when the original the Volkswagen names, people don't realize this, are all wins. So the Golf in German is the Gulfstream. Jetta came from the Jetstream. Passat
Which was
is
called
a win.
Bora elsewhere.
Right. The Passat
I'm
is a win.
surprised
The Scirocco's
Maserati
a win.
couldn't bother to go after them and sue them for sort of interference with their IP, because Maseratis have always been named after wins. Although Maserati's probably too busy going out of business and
Yeah.
hemorrhaging money to ever
To
file
ever
a
care
lawsuit.
about. The Germans are like, lawsuit? Yeah, good luck. You're not paying your lawyer. See you later.
Whereas the French were just petty enough to do it
They
with
would.
the 901, and then so
Yeah.
maybe this is well known. I think that the 911 was supposed to be called the 901,
Mm-hmm.
and then Peugeot's like, no. We use the 0 in the middle for our model name. This
There-
is the Peugeot way.
Merde alors. There's nothing more French than somebody sitting there with a Gauloise and a cup of coffee going, I don't like the idea that somebody else could have a name with a 0 in the middle. Like the Germans would be like, we have allowed any series of numbers from this number to this number, and everything in the middle is ours. And the French were like, if it has a 0, it is ours. So these Porsche people must rename this 9 something else, because if it has a 0 in the middle, it cannot be. Could you imagine any other culture coming up with that? But all right, back to turbos.
Yeah, we were supposed to be
We're
talking
supposed to be talking about
turbochargers.
turbos.
What's the oldest turbocharged car you've driven?
Saab 900 turbo would have to be it, which is
And-
an evolution of the 99 turbo.
Yes, so it had that sort of non-linear, like very sizable difference between turbo boost and,
Yeah.
and
And it was a late car, so it was a 16 valve.
Hmm.
It was actually commemorative edition, which is effectively the SPG.
yes, that's like
and
93, 94.
I think it was a 93. And it was nobody. Holy shit!
Yeah.
And that's kind of fun.
It is
That's-
kind of fun as long as you're not in the middle of a corner when that happens in a
in
rear-wheel
a
drive
front-
car.
Yeah, I was gonna say in a front-wheel drive car like that thing didn't really matter, except for the torque steer. I mean, that Saab layout is the dumbest. Like that's the
Yeah, so
that's
it's a
the
longitudinally mounted engine.
Which-
Transmission is in front or behind the engine?
underneath.
Ooh.
So here's the
Perfect.
thing: you can
Excellent.
have a longitudinally engined front-wheel drive car. All Audis are that way. You can. I mean, there's a Renault.
I mean, not all Audis, right?
All
Like,
of
isn't the
them-
new RS3 a transverse?
That's a Golf. That's not an Audi. I mean, okay. So all the Audi layout,
Yeah.
which is A4, A5, A6, A7. They're
And the
sort of
200.
well. No, I'm talking
but
right now. Right.
like historically, also
Historically,
with the
yeah.
Quattro, which is where this all.
And for example, VW, like the B5 Passat was actually a B5 A4. So that had the longitudinal layout. And actually the first gen Passat was longitudinal as well because it was an Audi. But anyway.
This is like 1970s. Yeah.
But you know, the Audi layout is a longitudinal, but the engine is in front, and then behind the engine is a transaxle, and there's a pass-through shaft that goes to a transmission, and then back front.
This is backwards Countach.
Backwards Countach, exactly. So that the output shafts from the transaxle are as close to the engine as possible. Otherwise, the engine would be 3 feet in front of the headlights. The Saab layout is backwards. So the output shaft of the engine is at the front of the car. And then there's a chain drive to bring the power down. Cadillac did this with the
We should do an
Northstar.
episode about Saab. Saab has done a lot of weird
Saab is
shit.
fucking awesome.
They've done a lot of weird,
Yeah.
or did a lot of weird shit,
Yep.
I should say.
But the coolest thing about that is that if you look under the hood of a 900 turbo, and the exhaust comes out the front of the engine, and there's a turbo up front, and then it does a U-turn back to the fact that it was so stupid.
The Bentley turbo motor, the Turbo R,
Mm-hmm.
is like that too. Like the exhaust manifolds all collect and then go forward, and the turbochargers like kind of down somewhere deep in the front of the bowels of the car,
Right.
probably directly by the radiator.
It's probably in front of the radiator to preheat the air to make sure that it will overheat at all times. But yeah, the old school turbos, these sort of outspokenly turbocharged cars, have a personality of their own.
Yes, it's very like exciting for sure.
It's
like an
the
STI.
netherworld where we live in most modern turbocharged cars that I don't like. It's the ones that are trying to pretend to have, like BMW will often do, their turbocharged engines will have immediate throttle response and then a lot of lag. And so you have a sudden quick reaction and then nothing, and then the turbos hit like a fucking bomb, and like the M4 is a very difficult car to control because of it. Whereas like Mercedes will go slightly bigger on displacement when they can, and then will fade in the turbo boost. Ferrari probably has the most advanced turbocharger control. So what they're doing is they're limiting peak boost in every gear so that you want to rev the engine out. Because the big problem that you have is it's so easy to be at 3,000 RPM at full throttle and just to sort of ride that wave of turbo torque. And they don't think that's the proper way to
drive a
enjoy your
Ferrari.
car, right? So they really limit it down, and they do a huge amount of things to limit peak boost so that the difference between off boost power and on boost power is small. That works, but actually the only turbocharged engines that I really like are the ones that combine, and I know I'm gonna get so much shit for this, hybrids. Because what you can then do is use an electric motor for
to
torque
fill.
fill.
Yeah.
So McLaren did this on the P1. The best example I can give to people to go out and try is any of the AMG 53 cars. So the Mercedes, like
Those are the 48 volt electric cars.
Yeah, and that's a straight six, 3-liter straight six with a turbo on it. And then not only does it have a turbo, it has a electric supercharger. So it's a supercharger that just runs off of 48 volt power. And then it has a sandwich motor in between the engine, basically on the flywheel. So when you start squeezing throttle, it obviously the electric motor can respond instantaneously, which it does, and then it immediately switches on the electric supercharger. That can get to full boost, which I think is 8 psi or 6 or 8 psi, within a third of a second. So you get an immediate response, followed by a third of a second later, the supercharger really comes online fully.
How much
and
oomph
then,
does the electric motor have? Like how many kilowatts?
20 something horsepower, 180 something pound feet of torque. I didn't do my homework for this episode, but enough. And then what happens is so the electric motor starts, the supercharger kicks in, and then as the turbo boost rises, it gradually switches off the supercharger. And it's the amazing part of that engine is the handoff between the three, because
Seamless.
you do not know.
That's really cool.
All you know is your 3-liter straight six feels like a 7-liter V12 or 8-liter V12, because it's just got this ridiculous torque all the time with the same immediate response, regardless of where you are on the rev range. You can catch it out every once in a while where it's not ready and something's going on. Maybe the battery's depleted and it doesn't have enough power to run the compressor. But most of the time, it's just immediate response.
I mean, I guess this is why turbo supercharging with like actual turbo and supercharged cars was a thing. Although,
it
like
is. Volvos. Volvos do it right now.
Oh, I meant like in the old days, like people are like, why don't we solve the turbocharger problem by putting a supercharger and a turbocharger on it? And like a few people did that, like the Lancia, like
S4,
Volume X, I think maybe your S4, yes.
Yep.
But like, I think everyone else was like, you're insane.
Well, you're insane because those cars were lacking the computer power to manage that transition
Right,
properly.
so there was like just this ragged, like unpredictable.
Yeah, it's adding insult to injury, like i.e. adding boost to before the turbo. Then Volkswagen did it with their twin-charged 1.4 in Europe that we never got
This
in
is
the US.
when?
2000, early 2000s? 2003-ish, somewhere around there. And now Volvo does it. So the only turbocharged
Oh,
supercharged
this is like
car.
the XC90 T6.
All current Volvo T6s are
T6.
turbocharged and supercharges. So they're the like T4s and T5s are turbocharged. T6 adds a supercharger, and T8 adds a hybrid motor to that. It's the same.
But it's all the
basic-
2-liter 4-cylinder.
It's all 2-liter 4-cylinder. And it's the same basic strategy that Mercedes is using, except it's a physical supercharger, like a crank-driven supercharger instead of an electric one, and it's not managed as well as Mercedes is. So we're gonna have turbocharged Ferraris, hybrid Ferraris coming up, like SF90. I'll be driving hopefully at the end of March, and that will have electric motors in that will probably, I assume, stand in as torque fill and fixes the problem that I have with turbocharged engines. So I think the future is bright for turbos.
Would you ever own a turbocharged car?
I have a list of cars that I kind of want, and none of them I've never put. Like I would have a GTI, but
A modern GTI.
a modern
like a
GTI.
Mark
But
7.
no. I say I would have a GTI, but I bought an e-Golf. I could have just as easily bought a GTI. No, I don't think I want to deal with the complexity, the fuel economy,
Especially vintage turbocharged
Oh, fuck
cars. I mean,
that. All it took was following you in that Audi. The thing was so beautiful. It's so magnificent. It sounds good. It's fast as shit. And next thing
Sometimes.
I know, we went 4 miles of like driving quickly on a back road and kaboom, and it cost you more than basically
Your
the
e-Golf.
car. Right. So yeah, I would love a Delta Integrale because of the way it looks and what it represents.
People ask me often actually about Delta Integrales. It's a really exciting car to drive. It's really fun to drive.
And then you get the Marvin the Martian moment. Where's the kaboom? There was another fucking earth-shattering kaboom, and the fucking thing explodes.
Yeah, and I will also say that it's a car that like, it's a great 8th or 9th car, but it's not a great 2nd or 3rd car because the expectation, especially in the US, like something's going to go wrong and then it'll be months and months of waiting while it
Parts.
gets resolved. And so it's a great 8th or 9th car, but I wouldn't put it any higher on your list. If you have less than 8 cars, you shouldn't have an Integrale.
Do you want a turbo? Is there a turbocharger? You had an Integrale, and of course it blew up. Like the engine actually had a compression issue, like every other Integrale that I know.
That's right. I forgot I had the Integrale as
Yeah.
well.
It was fast as fuck.
And
Oh my god, that car was fast.
Yes.
And there was a reason it was fast because it was blowing up.
I mean, like, so I'm a wildly impractical romantic person, so I probably will continue to own turbocharged cars. Like, I would own an RS2 just because I like that car conceptually so much. Like, there's a lot of stuff like that where I'll own it in spite of it being turbocharged, not because I want that experience.
But all right, so what is on your list?
Of turbocharged cars, an RS2. That's the thing that I'm actively thinking about right now that I would actually choose. Nothing else on my short list currently is turbo. Oh, an F40.
How could you say no to it? Even I would say fine.
Okay.
I would take a 288 GTO.
They're
Also,
very exciting cars to drive, like
know-
in
you've
that
driven one?
old-fashioned turbocharged way. I've driven an F40. I've not driven a 288.
I hate you for at least that. I've never driven either one.
But
of
it
them.
has all this drama and excitement to it that like a 959, that's one of the most disappointing cars for me personally, that I like of cars that I've gotten into and to drive and then like had the experience, it was one of the most disappointing experiences I've ever had.
The 959 accurately predicted the downfall of the world. I mean,
I say this. That was
Yeah.
my interpretation the first time I drove the car.
It accurately predicted the future of everything that I don't like about cars today.
Computer control, like twin turbocharging, 4-wheel drive.
Computer-controlled suspension.
Yeah.
Like needless over complexity
Yes.
for the purpose of going quickly, easily.
Yeah, and in a low effort, like,
Right.
yeah, I would rather go slowly with joy than quickly without.
I agree.
Which is I guess, summed up my position on turbocharging.
I could not agree more. I'm scared at how much I agree with you.